As explained in our previous video, Christianity in America, particularly Protestant Christianity of an evangelical stripe, dominated in the first half of the 19th century. The revivals of the Second Great Awakening washed over most of the land, and even if someone wasn't a Christian, most Americans identified with the general Christian consensus. One vital reason for this consensus was the linkage of Christian faith with the future of the American Republic, both in government and in the culture. Only through Christian faith, they believed, could the nation be secure. How can a people find that security besides through revivals of faith? What can come alongside the biblical message to confirm it and ensure it passes to future generations? One obvious answer is through education, preparing the next generation to be good Christian citizens who will transmit the faith to their descendants. As noted in another previous video, the Puritans of New England had an intense desire to establish education in their realm from the elementary level all the way through college. While there was some movement toward taxation for the purpose of schools in New England, in most of the states education was primarily a private affair. The home was a key to much early American education. Schools were set up mostly as private institutions, primarily in their respective denominations. Where population was sparse, tutors could instruct the children of the more well-to-do. The most significant educator in America once independence was achieved certainly was a man by the name of Noah Webster, who can credibly be called the schoolmaster to early America. Webster's first major accomplishment was the development of a speller, commonly known as the blue-backed speller, that could be found in most American homes. The speller helped Americans, even those who moved into the frontier areas, to learn how to not only to spell, but even more basically how to read. It was responsible for increasing literacy in the nation. Webster's stated goal with this speller was grounded in both culture and government. He sought to help forge a strong, effective union of the states. He was concerned that if the citizens of the various states pronounced words too differently, they would look upon one another with less respect. These differences might then become a wedge that would break apart the union, whereas his speller would introduce a uniformity and accuracy of pronunciation in the schools. Webster also wanted to Americanize the spelling of some English words. His initial attempt was too radical for general acceptance, but he did achieve some changes. Some of his changes that stuck were the elimination of K from words such as music and public, the change from S to C in words like practice, and from S to Z in words like organize. How successful was this speller? By 1861, it was selling 1 million copies per year, and in its first century, it sold 100 million. When Webster first published his speller, he was a churchgoer, but not a confirmed Christian in his heart. His religion was basically external. But the Second Great Awakening found its way to his home in New Haven, Connecticut. And in 1808, he submitted his life to Christ. Here's how he describes what happened. Quoting Webster now, he says, "The impressions grew stronger, till at last I could not pursue my studies without frequent interruptions. My mind was suddenly arrested, and as it were fastened to the awakening and upon my own conduct. I closed my books, yielded to the influence which could not be resisted or mistaken, and was led by a spontaneous impulse to repentance, prayer, and entire submission and surrender of myself to my Maker and Redeemer." From that point on, all of Webster's educational endeavors were grounded in his Christian faith, and he sought to promote that faith through his works. Now, most people today know the name Webster because of his dictionary, a one-person feat that took 20 years to complete. First published in 1828, Webster's dictionary was a vehicle for furthering his prescriptions for the moral, political, and intellectual improvement of his country. It incorporated his views on morality, principles, government, and education, became a testimony to the Christian convictions that first gripped him in 1808. Through biblical examples of word usage and even some mini sermons to aid the reader in knowing how a word should be understood, Webster hoped it could help remake government, schools, and other pertinent social institutions into the image of his Christian ideal. One scholar comments that the dictionary was, and I quote, "a one-man equivalent of the American Bible Society, the American Tract Society, the American Sunday School Union, the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance, or the American Home Missionary Society. Every copy, according to this man, carried the evangelical crusade into the classroom, library, and college, and Webster hoped that his dictionary would hold in every American home a place of honor beside the Bible. Protestant dominance in the educational realm was beginning to be challenged, though, by those who didn't want churches to be in charge of education and who thought that there should be more central control or guidance for what is taught. What became known as the Common School movement sought to set up schools with some government involvement. There were at least 3 separate groups seeking to make this change, all with different motivations. Unitarians were one force for the change. Now, theologically, Unitarians continued to call themselves Christians, but they denied the central belief in Orthodox Christianity that Jesus was truly God. Therefore, they wanted to shift the primary source of education away from the mainstream Orthodox denominations. They said such education in the churches was too sectarian, too much diversity in what was taught. Unitarians also diverged from traditional Christian teaching in believing that man can be perfected through education. Education, therefore, was the cure for all of the evils in society. Unitarians were certainly a minority in American culture at this time, but they did make major inroads in Massachusetts, in particular where Harvard had changed from its Puritan origins into a college more attuned to Unitarian beliefs. Boston became the first proving ground for Unitarians who wanted to change education. Convinced that many children were being overlooked, they took a survey in 1817 to try to prove that there was a high number of children in that city not being educated. The survey, however, proved otherwise, as it showed that 96% of Boston's children were enrolled in schools. What to do about the 4% who weren't, largely due to the cost? Well, the least costly way to have helped them would have been to fund scholarships or some other type of voluntary help. After all, this was the age of voluntary associations. Instead, they pushed for and won approval to set up an educational hierarchy in the city, thereby getting a foot in the door for government to oversee education. 2 decades later, Massachusetts became the first state to have a board of education controlled by the government. It was established in 1837 with educator Horace Mann as its first secretary. Now, Mann was a Unitarian. He was devoted to the Unitarian vision of how education could be the cure-all for all the woes in society. And there's one quote from Mann that makes this abundantly clear when he said the following. He said, "The common school is the greatest discovery ever made by man. Let the common school be expanded to its capabilities. Let it be worked with the efficiency of which it is susceptible, and 9/10 of the crimes in the penal code would become obsolete. The long catalog of human ills would be abridged. Men would walk more safely by day. Every pillow would be more inviolable by night. Property, life, and character held by a stronger tenure, all rational hopes respecting the future brightened." A more clear-cut statement of the Unitarian vision would be very hard to find. It rested on the perfectibility of mankind through education, without the benefit of the grace of God through Christ. Webster in neighboring Connecticut was aware of this new approach to education and was not thrilled by it. In a review he wrote about a book promoting the changes, he commented the following. He said, "Our primary schools may doubtless be improved, and I trust they will be, but you will permit a man, probably much older than yourself, to remark that in the modern schemes of improvement, many projects will be found to be visionary. The perfection sought is not attainable, and if it was, the results would disappoint expectation." So Webster, the Orthodox Christian, was writing from his perspective on the nature of mankind, which didn't agree with the Unitarian concept of human perfectibility. Although Unitarians made strides in some areas like Massachusetts, the number of Unitarians in America was never large. Their influence wasn't as strong as that of the mainstream Protestant evangelicals. They would need help in promoting the idea that the government should provide the cornerstone for educational goals. One ally came at it from a different direction. In 1825, a Welsh immigrant, Robert Owen, set up what he believed would be a utopian community in New Harmony, Indiana. Owen was anti-Christian in his personal beliefs. He promoted the idea that private property was the main problem in society because it created greed. He foreshadowed really what would later become more familiar in the communist vision of Karl Marx. Citizens of New Harmony were to give up all private property. The vision of a utopian community is one thing. The reality of a utopian community is something else. The attempt was an utter failure. It shut down 2 years after it began. Convinced that Americans needed to be educated out of their belief in private property, Owen's followers got involved in politics to attempt to establish government schools that would teach what they wanted. The Owenites, as they were called, created the Working Men's Party, political party, which tried at the local and state level to put their program into public policy. One man who belonged to the party and was active in it was Orestes Brownson. Now, Brownson later left it after he found Catholic faith, and so later he provided a clear explanation of the party's goals. Brownson wrote the following. He said, "The purpose in the formation of this party was to get control of the political power of the state so as to be able to use it for establishing our system of schools. We hoped by linking our cause with the ultra-democratic sentiment of the country, which had an anti-Christian character, by professing ourselves the bold and uncompromising champions of equality, by expressing a great love for the people, a deep sympathy with the laborer, whom we represented as defrauded and oppressed by his employer, by denouncing all proprietors as aristocrats, and by keeping the more unpopular features of our plan as far in the background as possible, to enlist the majority of the American people under the banner of the Working Men's Party. Nothing doubting that if we could once raise the party to power, we could use it to secure the adoption of our educational system." Brownson's expose of the goals of the Working Men's Party shows quite clearly its desire to remove the stigma of believing that private property should be abolished. But how many communists existed in America during this time? The party made few gains, and the combined efforts of this group, along with the Unitarians, wouldn't be sufficient to change the direction of American education. A more mainstream group would have to believe in the development of government education for it to become a reality. Surprisingly, that group was the evangelical Protestants, who already had dominance in the realm of education. Why would they join in a movement toward common schools under the thumb of the government? They moved in that direction due to fear. A demographic change was coming to America beginning in the 1830s and 1840s, an influx of Catholics, primarily because of economic distresses in Ireland. This triggered Protestant fears that America was threatened by the potential loss of the Protestant majority. We must remember that the Protestant-Catholic divide was much greater at that time. The history of the religious wars after the Reformation still remained in the cultural memory of the age. The fear that Catholicism would once again try to impose itself on a nation. How, in the face of this fear, could America remain Protestant? Could funneling all children through Protestant-dominated common schools be the answer? For the majority of Protestants, it was. They hoped to enforce Protestant orthodoxy through these common schools. And strangely, for a nation based on individual liberty and limited government, the education reformers, including the Protestants, looked to a country far different for a system to follow. They learned of an education system in Prussia that seemed to be effective for forcing conformity. Now, Prussia was a militaristic state that later became a key part of a unified Germany. The Prussian model for education mirrored the ideology of the society. First, it believed the state was the absolute authority and that people lived to serve the state. Applied to education, that philosophy set up a policy of compulsory attendance in schools, a uniform curriculum taught only by teachers trained by the state. Parents who dared to object to this system were punished by the government. On its surface, it was the opposite of the liberty Americans were used to. Philosophically, it was the opposite of all the constitutional safeguards established by America's founders. For a nation that had freed itself from a state church, this system forced belief in whatever the state said should be taught in schools. Government telling citizens, in effect, what to believe. Protestant evangelicals ignored the problem because they considered the danger so great that only force could protect a Protestant America. Now, it's not that they were trying to foist some evil thing on Americans, and keep in mind that Catholics set up many of their own schools to avoid this system. But Protestants saw it as a simple and effective way to achieve their goals. After all, they were the dominant religious belief in the nation, and could control what the schools taught. What they didn't realize, though, is that once the system was set up, it would depend on Protestants remaining in control in future years. But what if that were not the case? What if the nation didn't continue to be dominated by Protestant thought? What if new ideas gained ground and the system were to be controlled by different beliefs? That's precisely what happened. And we will cover that in a future video. By violating the principle of influencing society by voluntary means, they also violated the essence of the gospel message. Other changes in thinking, besides in education, occurred during this era. The communism of Robert Owen was only one attempt at a utopian society. Some of these experimental, hoped-for utopian communities claimed to be founded on Christian beliefs, but others clearly diverged from Orthodox Christianity. Since Unitarians were foremost in trying to alter educational philosophy, I mentioned that movement in passing, because it rejected Christ's divinity and dismissed the Bible as revelation from God and used it mostly as an ethical guideline. Well, Unitarians also denied the existence of the supernatural, the miracles recorded in Scripture. Another deviation from orthodoxy was the rise of Universalism, which simply meant that the Bible depiction of hell was not authoritative. Universalists were called by that name because they believed that Christ's death meant everyone, regardless of one's life, would find a place in heaven. There is no hell. Another rising challenge was the founding of the Mormon religion by Joseph Smith and then developed further by Brigham Young. Mormonism accepts the morality of Christian faith, yet changes the theology in ways that places it outside Orthodox Christianity. Yet, as was the case with education, sometimes mainstream Protestants found ways to undermine their Christian witness from within the church. It's not always attacks from the outside that are the most dangerous. Whenever the church violates biblical standards, it does even greater damage to the faith. Slavery, of course, is the prime example and will be the subject of the next video. But another example is the church's contradictory message with respect to treatment of Native Americans. We touched on this subject when we analyzed colonial New England's reaction to the praying Indians during King Philip's War in the 17th century. Rather than seeing Christian natives as equals in the kingdom of God, they were viewed more from a racial angle and were put into captivity during the war. Whenever a distinction is made based more on racial or ethnic grounds than on theological understanding, we go awry. During the antebellum period, many natives were removed from their ancestral grounds and sent to lands across the Mississippi River. The most well-known of these removals involved the Cherokee Nation. Most people have heard of the Trail of Tears and those who died during the removal. What was the church's attitude toward that removal? It was the government that made the decision, not any church. But did Christians care what was happening? I have found Daniel Blake Smith's book, An American Betrayal, Cherokee Patriots and the Trail of Tears, to be a well-balanced account of this event. Smith shows the greed of Georgians for Cherokee land, the disdain for the Cherokees in the government, except for a Supreme Court ruling in the Cherokees' favor, and even the problems within the Cherokee Nation as disagreements divided the people, some in favor of removal, most not. In the removal itself, Smith notes that much of the supply problem lay at the feet of the Cherokees who didn't deliver as promised. He also, for our purposes, is balanced when considering how Christians looked upon natives and this particular removal. On the plus side, there was an outreach to the Cherokee, and 2 young leaders were educated at a Christian boarding school in Connecticut. The negative side was when both of them decided to marry white women that they had met while at the school. At that point, racism entered the picture. The community deplored that desire, tried to stop it from happening, because it was unheard of in that Christian circle that a white woman would marry a native. Although criticized severely, both went through with their marriages. When the second marriage occurred a year after the first one, the school issued a condemnation of the relationship. This was purportedly a Christian school seeking to bring natives to Christ, but it called the relationship criminal and, quoting, an insult to the known feelings of the Christian community. Further, the marriage was, and this is a quote again, sporting with the sacred interests of this charitable institution. Clearly, this outreach was based more on paternalism than sincere belief in everyone being made in God's image. Yet we must not stereotype all Christians with the attitude that dominated that New England school. The missionaries who worked side by side with the Cherokee in Georgia were deeply upset by the racism being displayed. Smith explains the problem that faced the missionaries. He writes, "Since first arriving in Indian country in the early 1800s, missionaries mostly found favor, even admiration, among whites and even many Indians, who watched their efforts to bring Christianity to Native Americans. Indeed, before 1828, they were generally viewed as heroic figures in the backcountry. With Jackson's election and the rising tension over removal, however, missionaries quickly became pawns in an increasingly volatile political climate. Trapped between Cherokees they wanted to protect and white settlers and politicians suspicious of their loyalties, missionaries were fast becoming an endangered people in Indian country. It got so bad that the Georgia legislature declared war on the missionaries. It passed a law stating that all white males living within the Cherokee Nation as of March 1st, 1831 would be arrested and sentenced to 4 years of hard labor. Samuel Worcester, a staunch missionary friend of the Cherokees, stood up to the law and was arrested. The appeal went up to the United States Supreme Court. In 1832, the court vacated Worcester's conviction and declared the Georgia law unconstitutional. It was a significant legal victory, but Jackson, as president, refused to enforce it, and the pathway to the Trail of Tears continued. Over 4,000 Cherokees died making the trek to Oklahoma Territory. I referred to the Christian attitude toward natives as a mixed message. On the one hand, there was a racial bias that tainted what should have been a clear gospel message of salvation for all. But it's also important to point out the heroic stand that many missionaries made in the face of greed and illegality and the threat of prison. It should also be mentioned that many Christians in the North opposed the removal. We will see an almost identical mixed message when we analyze how Christians handled the issue of slavery, which is where we will go in the next video.
Now